I wasn't there, so I don't really know if that's exactly how it happened. I can tell you two things I know for sure about this story. First is, it appears in all four Gospels. In fact, the basic information of the story appears in all four Gospels, exactly the same. Each of the Gospel authors tells it a little bit differently because they add their own context, their own little details and things. But the basic details of the story are in all four Gospels. And at least to me, that gives it a level of authenticity. Not necessarily reality, but it gives it a certain authenticity. Everyone seems to know this story. In fact, generally speaking, if you've been to church more than one or two times, you know this story. It's very familiar. The basic information. We know slightly different versions of it. John says there was a little boy who had the loaves and fishes, right? Depending on which gospel you're reading, it might be located in different places in the timeline of Jesus' ministry. But the basic details are the same. The other thing I know for sure is that no matter how you tell the story, or however you want to interpret the story, it's a miracle story. There is no way to tell this story or interpret this story that there isn't a miracle in the story. There just isn't. Sorry. So if you're someone who's concerned that I'm about to explain away this story, there's no way you can tell the story that it isn't a miracle. If you tell this story as if it's Jesus using the power of God, which is in Jesus because he's the Son of God, the Word made flesh, Jesus has the power of God. Maybe not the power of Grayskull, but he's got the power of God, and he's going to use that power. And this is about Jesus using the power and proving that he is the Messiah, the Son of God, the Word made flesh. It's a miracle. It's a miracle. And it proves that Jesus is who the gospel writers say he is. Because it's a miracle. It's magical. It's supernatural. It's unnatural. There's actually, isn't it interesting, whatever words we use to describe something that's not naturally occurring in nature, it seems to somehow gain a negative connotation that makes it sound vaguely impossible. And yet it's not, because it's Jesus. It's a miracle. If what this story tells you is that what happened was Jesus wanted to feed the people, and all the disciples had basically was enough not even to feed a family, and so Jesus offered that. He might have even said, hey, you guys take the bigger part. I don't really need anything. I'm good. You feed, you take it. And that act of radical generosity inspired people that were in the crowd to share what they had. Because let's be honest, in Jesus' day, the likelihood of you going anywhere, any great distance anywhere, without taking food with you is probably pretty remote. You'd take something. You'd have to, because there were no restaurants. There were no inns. You were relying on basically the hospitality of others, which, by the way, is a thing in the culture of Jesus' day. Hospitality is already a thing, and here's Jesus going above and beyond. Maybe he inspired such radical generosity amongst the crowd that suddenly they all found they had things to share. Here, take half my granola bar. Take a piece of my fry bread, which I happened to bring with me. I brought lunch. Who wants some? It's still a miracle. You can't tell me you get a crowd of people together and suddenly they all want to share their food. It's like a magical potluck. Ooh. It's a miracle. It is. Still a miracle. if you're telling this story because it never really happened, it's a metaphor, and it's a metaphor for the love of God, so generously given and shared amongst us, or it's simply a metaphor for active generosity and goodwill, kindness, still a miracle. If you're telling it as a metaphor for how we understand abundance and lack, it's still a miracle. There's no way you can tell this story that it's not a miracle. The real question isn't, is it a miracle? The real question is, which one of these miracles speaks the most to you? And that's where the importance of who's telling the story comes in. Because Matthew tells this story in a very particular place. If you were reading this from any other translation, New Revised Standard Version Updated, which is what we usually use, any other translation, but the one we use this morning, the First Nations version, the story would begin, and after that, Jesus went off by himself in a boat. The people telling the story in the First Nations version decided to tell you why Jesus went off in a boat, but the other versions don't. And so if you pick up this story right there, you might go right by that. And so Jesus went off by himself. Oh, okay, Jesus went off by himself. The crowd followed him. Wow, crowds are demanding, aren't they? People just can't leave him alone. He can't get away from people. Hang on. Because what's happened right before this is that John the Baptist, the messenger who announces the coming of the Messiah, Jesus, a colleague in ministry, according to Luke at least, a cousin of Jesus, has been put to death by Herod. Unwillingly, right? I mean, we know that story. You're familiar with that story. Salome dances and demands the head of John the Baptist. The thing is, John was becoming a problem for Herod because he was telling too much truth, and he was a prophet. Herod was afraid of him, but Herod's wife very definitely was not, and managed to get him killed. Jesus has just heard this news. Your friend, colleague, person of significance to you, not just because they're your cousin, but someone important to you, has just been killed, brutally killed. How do you feel? Jesus wanted to be by himself because he was grieving. But wait, because Matthew doesn't stop there. The next thing we hear is, when the crowd heard it, they didn't want to leave Jesus by himself. It's really easy to interpret this story as the crowd is just super demanding and won't leave Jesus alone. But what if the crowd who was following Jesus, who in all likelihood would have been not only familiar with John, but would have heard him and perhaps even followed him before they even got to Jesus, what if the crowd was grieving too? What if the reason the crowd didn't want to leave Jesus alone was because they were all grieving this loss? What if somehow the crowd, as well as Jesus, realized that being by yourself in this moment of grief was not going to be as meaningful as being together? That sharing grief in community, even if it's just doing the work I've been doing kind of work, which is what Matthew says happens. Jesus had compassion. There's the key right there, isn't it? It's a miracle of compassion, of people sharing their grief together and finding compassion. That's the context in which Matthew places a story in which all are fed miraculously. It's not just a story about power, the ability to make something happen. It's not just a story about generosity, or kindness. It's a story about compassion. The crowd wants to be with Jesus, I think, not just because Jesus can do stuff for them, because they want to be with Jesus. What if this is a story that's also about not just the compassion of Jesus, but the capacity of the crowd, the community, to have compassion together? What if this is a story that isn't just about the miracle of generosity found in a crowd, but the miracle of compassion found in community? I think after a story like this, and not just because of the miracle of feeding, but of the context of this story, the people in this community that formed around this moment went away changed by it. I actually kind of think that's one of the reasons why there's leftovers. Where do you think those leftovers went? 12 baskets full of leftovers. Where do leftovers go at a potluck? They go two places, don't they? They either go home with the person who brought it, or if there are people there in the community who don't have much food at home and can't afford much food at home, don't you send the leftovers home with them? Yeah, you do. We've all been to enough church potlucks to see that both of those things happen. This isn't just a story of one miracle, it's a story of many. That's what makes it such a miraculous story. A story that isn't just about the moment, but about how people have been changed in this moment. They go away with their life changed. That's the power of community. Not just the power of compassion, not just the power of generosity, but the power of sharing in it as a community.